you, everyone. You may all take your seats now. I'd now like to present a brief overview of the course. This course introduces participants to the intersection of post-colonial literary study and the study of the natural environment, or eco-criticism. These two areas examine the most pressing global concerns in our time, which has been termed the Anthropocene, the period beginning with European colonialism when humans began to have a major effect on the planet's ecosystems. This course provides an overview of literary works from countries and most African countries whose knowledge is particularly perceptive in depicting these planetary changes in their art. The course explains how these developments correlated with intellectual discussions and artistic movements concerning the effects of human activities on nature, and how these intellectual and artistic approaches shaped, for example, the Romantic movement, ideas of the sublime and the picturesque, notions of pastoralism and wilderness, perceptions of non human animals, and anti colonial resistance. Analytical concepts the course covers will include ecological imperialism, environmental justice, risk theory, the land ethic, toxic disclosure, urban ecologies, indigeneity, queer ecologies, eco-ambiguity, new materialisms, national ecologies, bioregionalism, and petrocultures. Now that we have a brief insight into what this course will entail over the next 6 days, may I invite our course coordinator, Dr. Preeti Bhatt ma'am, for the welcome address. Dr. Preeti Bhatt is an associate professor in English and head of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, MNIT Jaipur. With a teaching experience of more than 25 years, Dr. Bhatt's research interest lies in 20th century fiction and drama, Indian writing in English, narrative theory, and communication skills. Ma'am.
Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this insightful course on the intersection of post-colonial literary studies and eco-criticism. The course examines how literature from formerly colonized regions depicts environmental changes and engages with critical concepts such as ecological imperialism, environmental justice, and indigeneity. We are honored to have with us Professor Alan Johnson today. Professor Alan Johnson is a professor of English at Idaho State University, where for 25 years he has specialized in post-colonial literature with an emphasis on India. He has contributed extensively in the academic community, serving as a reviewer for leading journals including PMLA, ISLE, and Post-Colonial Text. He has authored two significant books, Out of the Bounds, Indo-Anglian Literature, and India's Forests, Real and Imagined, Writing the Indian Nation. Professor Allen continues to engage in groundbreaking research. His current work explores how modern writers use motifs of pilgrimage to examine human encounters with the material world. With his vast engagement in post-colonial studies, Professor Johnson will bring invaluable insights to this course, and we look forward to it. We welcome you, sir. We also welcome Professor Mahesh Jat, sir, who is the local coordinator for Gian at MNIT Jaipur and also the faculty in charge for CDEC. And sir has been very helpful in helping us to manage all the logistics and the permissions and all the formalities for organizing this course, and his support is truly appreciated. Welcome you, sir. On behalf of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, MNIT Jaipur, I extend a warm welcome to all the participants who have come from all over India, and we are happy that you could come in person, though many of you expressed that difficulty, in managing this leave or study leave of 6 days or so. But we are very grateful that you could somehow get the permissions and also travel all the way from your local places to Jaipur. I hope this journey of 6 days sparks meaningful discussions. Wishing you all a fruitful learning experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I'm sure that all of us present here are eager to engage with this extremely well-designed course. We are honored and privileged to have with us our international expert for the same, Professor Alan Johnson. Okay. So may I now call upon the local Gyan coordinator, Professor Mahesh Jat, sir, to say a few words.
Time to visit us and giving me at most from Gian and on very relevant topic that is basically intersection of environment. So maybe I am civil engineer, so I know that how the environment is coming into literature, and that is very significant. I was struggling to link that socio-economic aspects are very, very critical nowadays, and we people have realized that STEM is not really progressing well without putting socio-economic aspects into engineering. So thank you, sir, for dealing with such a nice topic and thoughts. Again, I welcome all the participants from different institutes, and they are visiting from different parts of country. So thank you very much for visiting our institute, and I hope that our distinguished colleagues, Professor Nidhi and Professor Bhatt, they are taking care of you well. And I hope that in next 5 days you will be learning a lot. And I request you all that please do visit our other departments and the institute facilities and have a look on that. And also, please provide us a feedback. I guess in the last, Madam is taking feedback so that we can improve the next programs that is lined up. And I congratulate you, Madam, that this is the first program of GAN in the year 2025, and this government is taking a lead in this. So, and then they are working very hard, really, to begin a new course, a new center in IIIT Hyderabad. So there are a lot of logistic issues, a lot of accounts related issues. So they are really working hard, and I guess they are not, you can say, leaving anything to make this program a success. So congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So as we'll be engaging with ecosystems, eco-criticism and nature, we thought that a green welcome would be befitting for the occasion. And for the same, I request Professor Mahesh Jaj, sir, to please present a token of welcome, a sapling, to our esteemed resource person, Professor Alan Johnson. Professor Johnson has worked at the Idaho State University for 25 years now and has specialized in post-colonial literature with an emphasis on India. Besides post-colonial studies, he has taught a wide range of courses at the undergraduate and doctoral levels on topics that include world literature and religion, globalization and literature, world mythologies and epics, eco-criticism, and history of the novel. He has served as a reviewer for many academic journals, including PMLA, IEL, and Post-Colonial Texts, and has presented at numerous conferences in North America, Europe, and Asia. Professor Johnson is the author of 2 books, Out of Bounds and India's Forests, Real and Imagined. He has also published scholarly articles on a range of topics, including eco-critical readings of Indian literature, Hindi film teaching Amitav Ghosh, Mahasweta Devi's fiction, and the value of the humanities. In addition, he has published as A.G. Johnson a mystery novel set in an Indian hill station, Family Plot, in the year 2020, and several personal essays, including one in the September-October 2024 issue of News India. We surely look forward to gaining insights from your extensive research and work over the duration of this course. For now, may I please invite you for the inaugural address.
Thank you very much for those kind words, and thank you for having me here. It's delightful to be here. I want to thank and Professor Bhatt and Professor Bansal and the Gian organization of the government. That's wonderful. It's also a wonderful pun, which I like, Gian. And so I hope I have some Gian to share with you today. So yeah, I'm just delighted to be here. I come to India often, but it's a beautiful campus. I haven't been here before. And in the week ahead, I hope that we can exchange ideas. This is a broad topic, and some of you have varying backgrounds. So if you find some parts of it that you are familiar with to be redundant or quite familiar, hopefully there'll be other parts that aren't. And the main thing is to intersect all these different approaches and see how they all overlap. So, and as was said, this is, I think, another important part of this is that it's a privilege to be part of a humanities offering on an NIT campus, so, and that's so important today. So it's very valuable to share our knowledge across disciplines. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, sir. I would now like to invite course coordinator Dr. Nidhi Bansal ma'am to deliver the vote of thanks. Dr. Nidhi Bansal holds the position of assistant professor in sociology at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at MNIT. With more than 15 years of teaching and research experience, her academic interests encompass sociology, digital inequalities and marginalization, sociology of gender, gerontology and social policy, rural development, and public policy. Ma'am.
Thanks, Rishita. And it's my privilege to extend a vote of thanks on behalf of MNIT Jaipur. As we begin with this exciting journey of learning and collaboration, I would like to take a moment to express our heartfelt gratitude to all those who have contributed in planning and organization of this program. First and foremost, I would like to express our sincere appreciation to our director, Professor N.P. Padi, for providing visionary leadership and continuous support to our academic endeavors. Your unwavering commitment to excellence has laid the foundation for such enriching experiences. We are incredibly grateful to Professor Alan Johnson, who has come all the way from USA, who is the key resource person and subject expert for this course. Thank you for taking out time to share your knowledge and expertise with us. We are truly excited to learn from your extensive experience, and we hope that you have a comfortable stay at MNIT Jaipur. We are grateful to the Global Initiative of Academic Networks, that is GAN, Ministry of Education, Government of India, that is presently being coordinated by IIT Hyderabad, for providing financial support for organizing this event. A special thanks to our GAN coordinator, Professor Mahesh Kumar Jat sir, whose hard work and dedication have played a pivotal role in organizing and bringing this course together. Your meticulous planning and seamless coordination have ensured that this event is set to be a memorable one, and we are truly appreciative of your efforts. We are thankful to Professor Lav Bhargav, who is Dean of Research and Consultancy at MNIT Jaipur, for his support in making this GAN course a reality. Our sincere gratitude towards our participants who have joined this course from various parts of the country. Your enthusiasm and willingness to engage in this learning experience are what makes this course really meaningful and special. We look forward to a fruitful exchange of ideas, knowledge, and insights throughout this program, which is extending for 6 days. I would like to acknowledge and thank Department of Humanities and Social Sciences for their valuable support in facilitating this event. I'm very thankful to Dr. Preeti Bhatt, Associate Professor in English and Head of the Department and Co-Coordinator for this course. She was available at each step to manage the challenges that came our way throughout the planning phase and execution phase. A heartfelt thanks to our student coordinators, Saloni, Ankita, Muskan, Rajkumar, who are helping us throughout the course, and your assistance is truly invaluable, and your dedication ensures that program runs smoothly. Thank you so much. We would like to express our sincere thanks to NKN technical support team for ensuring that all technological aspects of this course are well taken care of. So to conclude, I would like to once again thank each one of you for your valuable contribution. We are excited to embark this journey of learning and collaboration, and we look forward to this fruitful discussions and experiences which are lying ahead in this course. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And with this, we now come to the conclusion of the inaugural ceremony. We will beginning with the first session of the day, which is Key Concepts and Developments in Eco-Criticism, followed by Key Concepts and Developments in Post-Colonial Literature and Eco-Criticism, and finally, Post-Colonial Nature Writing and its Antecedents. Here I sign off and hand over the mic to our expert, Professor Johnson. Thank you.
Because we will be recording the sessions and they are going to be live streamed, so we would request you not to speak during the talk, and we can have our questions and discussions with sir later on after his talk is over. Okay, so we have one session, session 1, followed by a 10 minutes break, then session 2, and then we break for lunch, and we come back for lunch for the third session. So while sir is speaking, we will all be quiet so that there is no audio disruption. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. I forgot that. Um, pardon me also while I shuffle through my pages here, because I have much more content than I need. And I'm not sure how much time this will involve, so I will be moving through these. I want to say at the outset that post-colonial studies, which I know most of you know the basics of, and eco-criticism are entwined in more ways than I think we sometimes realize. I learned this myself starting about 12 years ago when I first started on eco-criticism. Yeah,
You have to fix the camera on your
okay.
focusing on you.
Okay.
You have to set the ठीक है सामने आप आ रहे हो तो कैमरा इन पे फोकस नहीं कर
Yeah, they want that.
Do you think it's okay? Maybe just see if this is okay.
I can little bit zoom out.
Okay. Well, good. Yeah, as we can see, science and technology are. I was starting to talk about post-colonialism and eco-criticism, but I want to add a footnote that science and technology are are a double-edged sword in the sense that we need them to fight to help our sustainability efforts for broadcasting education. But on the other hand, we know that places, big companies like Google and things like that, they require so much energy to function and are probably eating up a third of the Earth's energy needs. So this is the paradox we live with. So I thought I would mention that. So back to post-colonial studies, which I think most of you know about, and eco-criticism. They are combined both historically and ideologically. So I want to try to explore that a little bit in this very broad survey that we're doing here. And one reason is that, as we see, and as some of you know, European colonialism was indeed what we call modernity in some ways, and it's also what we call globalization, modern globalization. The world has been globalized for 1,000 years, but the intense degree and the amount of resources needed to sustain that modern sense of globalization grew with the Industrial Revolution, and those European countries, in the modern sense, would not have become modern and developed without exploiting so much of the world. So I think that's also interesting to think about. And I think, of course, Amitabh Ghosh and other writers are showing that so brilliantly in their imaginative use of literature to show, for example, in Sea of Poppies, how 200 years ago, more than that, these historical and economic, political interconnections produced the modern, what we think of as the modern world. There are many modernities, but the dominant point that I think is starting to finally change, but until now, the dominant Eurocentric way. So that's the political economic part. The ideological part is as we'll see, and I'll get to in more detail, how Romanticism in Europe, starting with in Germany, really ironically began in some ways with the translation in India, as you know, of Shakuntala by Kalidasa by Sir William Jones in 1789. So this was a huge hit in Germany and then quickly in the other countries. There are many reasons for, that's another story about why Germany. In a way, then, these countries saw India, sort of ancient India, as the cradle of civilization, but that had its own problems, right, in the way that they conceived it. So that's the idea. So that informs Romanticism. And then, ironically, as so many ironies of history, Romanticism partly inspired people like Bankim Chandra Chakrabarty and others to, they had their own ideas, of course, but so they have this Romanticism that was inspired by Indian ideas that then inspired the modern, anti-colonial ideas. So it's I love those connections, right? So try to explore that. So those kinds of intersections are what I'm interested in. As you'll see, I like interdisciplinary research. But I'll do my best to spell some of these out. The other aspect of this first lecture is also, which itself is an overview, is also the importance in the modern literary sense of American transcendentalism. So we have people like Henry David Thoreau, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and a few others who read the Upanishads and were profoundly influenced by that, right? And so Thoreau is an eco-critical, one of the forebears of modern eco-environmental studies in many ways, because he goes and talks in Walden about living in 1 year just only in touch with nature. He's a brilliant naturalist, by the way. So all of these influences are fascinating, and we can go on and, if we had time, to talk about, and American Studies is not my area, but having taught different survey classes, we can see the influence of the transcendentalists right up until recently, even today in America, with the Beat generation, Ken Kerouac, Ginsberg, who came to India many times, and so on, right? And I think that there are many, many artists and writers who recognize these connections, but the mass public, or especially our junior students, don't always, right? That's where we come in as teachers, right? We can broadcast that and inspire people to look across these borders. And I teach in a university, now I'm getting way off this topic, but I teach in a university which serves a rural population. And they are quite narrow-minded, right? They don't live in a big city. We live in a small town. Many of the parents are farmers and things like that. And they don't travel much. So it's fun to see how you open their eyes sometimes to these connections. And I think that's important today, right, in our world. So I wanted to just start with those broad ideas. Some of the more specific terms that we'll look at, I will touch briefly a little bit later on post-colonial terms, even though in my experience, many people are familiar with the basics of that. So I think the eco-critical part has been developing, came a little later, and has been developing very fast. So things like, of course, we have the ideas of the sublime and picturesque and romanticism. We have pastoralism and the idea of wilderness. We'll talk about that. But we also have environmental justice issues that are so important today, right? Certainly they have always been, but they are more important. Risk theory, which has become very important. The land ethic, which starts in with the American naturalist Aldo Leopold. But really, a lot of these ideas have been around for centuries, but they are now applied in a modern sense. So toxic discourse, which I think is very important today as we talk about our polluted climate, and how certain works of literature are really, I think that's how people can grasp that, right? The reality of that. New materialisms, eco-ambiguity, national ecologies, so bioregionalism, petrocultures, and there are others. So that's what we look for. So just to get started, I'm going to read from this and sometimes add a few snippets from other points. Maybe a way to illustrate this is when I was at the University of the Philippines in teaching a course one summer about 5 years back. They have a wonderful botanical garden in the campus in Manila. Well, it's a suburb of Manila. And one of the biologists for this literature conference gave us a tour of the botanical gardens, and he asked the Filipino students, what is your national tree? What is your national flower? So they answered. He said, for each of them, he said, those are not native to the Philippines, right? So we're familiar with ecological imperialism, where starting with Columbus, right? We have what is called the Columbian Exchange, based on Columbus's name, the infamous Christopher Columbus, and that was when, for example, you know this, that like green chilies, things like that are not native to India, right? The Portuguese brought them. Potatoes were only in what is now Peru, right? Now they're everywhere in the world. Can you think of Ireland without potatoes, right? Or Irish literature without the potato famine? So those kinds of things are also part of this vast area. But what I think is we need to have an idea of this broad intersection, because whenever we read a text, then we can sort of illuminate it both for ourselves and for our students, and maybe make a difference in the world, hopefully. So, I like to keep that in mind. And so the tour of the botanical gardens was disillusioning in the Philippines for the Filipino students, because what? That's not native. Like eucalyptus trees in India, I went to school in Korea, and there the eucalyptus trees are a hazard, but they keep being planted because they grow fast. The British introduced them from Australia. They grow quickly, but they have shallow roots and suck up all the water, kills the native species. They topple. One fell on our roof when I was in boarding school. So I have a connection to eucalyptus, but we think of those as native, but they are not. That doesn't mean there aren't native species, and we can now use Google to look that up. And we aren't going to change that. We can't put genie in the bottle. But it's important to know about as we read these books of literature. So what is post-colonial eco-criticism? Each of these two parts already encompasses a vast repertoire of scholarship concerning an equally large corpus of literary works, so that we can go back and read, as you know, say Shakespeare's The Tempest or Midsummer Night's Dream through an eco-critical lens. At the same time, we have more and more and more works being written from all around the world that are wonderful works that are environmentally conscious explicitly. This course sort of touches on the most salient features of these, so that we can offer interpretations of books like The Hungry Tide, right? Different ways of looking at this. So the aim is to introduce the combined application of these approaches. The most obvious motivations that postcolonialism and eco-criticism share broadly is to decenter dominant discourses, or institutionalized ideologies, if you want to use another word, synonym for discourse, and habits of thinking, to decenter those. Postcolonialism obviously aims to decenter European colonial discourses and their legacies. Eco-criticism decenters the human subject as the end-all of perception and existence by demonstrating that natural environments are equally important, just as important as human environments. Indeed, since humans are part of nature, it's in our interest to understand how we intersect. All humans must contend with the challenges of making their way in an often difficult world, but as we will see, as you probably know, colonized peoples or anyone who is oppressed in some way, because the great thing about post-colonial critique is you can apply it to, as we'll see, to Native Americans, indigenous peoples, where our land is on Native American land. At my university, for example, we acknowledge that. So, how we can apply the post-colonial concepts to those, and how oppressed peoples have to contend with additional psychological and material burdens. So everyone has to contend with that to some degree. But we know the added, right, cultural fragmentation and so forth. So writers who effectively describe the combination of those layers produce works that I believe are among the richest and most thought-provoking today. My theory has always been, teaching post-colonial literature, that one reason it's so popular around the world is, of course, brilliant writing, but also because so many people these days feel decentered, feel dislocated, feel disoriented. Doesn't mean they share the same experiences. But now I also add to that we also feel climate change, right? So I was talking to a professor here about how heavy the rains are now here in parts of Rajasthan. How everywhere you go, climate is changing. No. We do have, unfortunately, in our country, quite a few climate deniers, but that's another challenge. As we explore this topic, so bear in mind the historical aspects, and as I mentioned, and how, as we know in Romanticism, keep in mind that the paradox is always that as humans progress and become more industrialized and more urban, they then realize what they've lost. Sometimes, is it too late? I don't know. The post-colonial scholar Rob Nixon, now known as a post-colonial eco-critic, he didn't start that way, noted in an essay 20 years ago that although he and others had been linking post-colonial concerns to environmental ones, the two critical approaches had not yet been formally conjoined. So that was 20 years ago. Now they have. But I think it's worth listening to what he says, because we have to remember this history. Nixon proposed several reasons for the schism, as he called it, that are still worth bearing in mind. First, he argued, whereas post-colonial critique had rightly emphasized history and the messiness or hybridity of cultures, that's right. So whereas post-colonial studies had done that, environmentalist scholars had tended to highlight nature as timeless and pure. That was the history. I would say more like until maybe 30 years ago. That was a common view. Timeless and pure. And we still get that attitude. Right? Second, noted Nixon, post-colonial critics have been preoccupied with depictions and theorizations of displacement. Rightly so. Displacement, migration, diaspora, and so on. While environmentalist critics had emphasized what he calls the literature of place. So being in place. Third, post-colonial studies had favored transnationalism and cosmopolitanism. If you think of Homi Bhabha and that kind of thing, and Edward Said. In contrast to environmentalists stressing bioregionalism and a tendency to approach literary depictions of natural environments within a national framework, especially with the rise of eco-criticism in the U.S. starting in the roughly around 1990-ish, maybe the late 80s, you had overemphasis on American ways of thinking, American literary examples. And this then once it came into contact with post-colonial, broadened out and became much richer and more accurate. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, where post-colonial studies focused on marginalized communities and other forms of oppression, environmental studies continue to erase as the nature writer John Muir, is anyone who studies American literature. He was actually from Scotland originally, but he was instrumental in institutionalizing the first national parks in the U.S., which is very important. But I've hiked some of those parks, and what you realize is, if you're listening, even the signs will tell you that to create the parks, certain numbers of Native Americans were displaced in the 1890s, 1900, like that, which is sort of forgotten. So people come to them with this idea that these have been pure and empty people, which is not true. When local inhabitants were championed, as Marxist critic Raymond Williams did, in favoring rootedness, right, or natural communities, he called them, in small-town England, and which was good. Again, he was coming from a Marxist viewpoint, but he favored that. He went quite far, and he favored that over immigrations of more visibly different people. That's Raymond Williams, which is troubling, ironically, because he influenced Edward Said's. The Black British sociologist Paul Gilroy, who famously inaugurated Black Atlantic studies, rightly objected to these sentiments as well a long time ago. So Nixon notes that postcolonialism can help, and I'm quoting here, can help diversify our thinking beyond the dominant paradigms of the wilderness, unquote. The kind of gentleman, one of the founding members of America, Thomas Jefferson, advocated, right? Again, erasing Native peoples. So the gentleman farmer idea also erases the experience of hybridity, displacement, and transnational memory. So that's what postcolonialism brings to you. So it can foster a transnational ethics of place that can help us rethink the pastoral. We'll come to some of those terms, pastoral and pastoralism, in terms of colonial and post-colonial concerns. So whereas Raymond Williams had pioneered the rethinking of English pastoralism by drawing attention to the harsh labor that produced it, right, which inspires Edward Said in Culture and Imperialism to, for example, in 1993, to talk about how if you read Jane Austen, you can read it through a lens of saying why all those big manors and estates were created on the backs of plantations built on slave labor, right? It's troubling to, if you like Austen, right? Some people say, oh no, that ruins my appreciation. But it's not Jane Austen. It's providing the context. So, so I think that's important to keep in mind. To illustrate how a post-colonial critical approach can illuminate post-colonial texts, Nixon offers the example of B.S. Naipaul, on whom he had written originally when he was young, who he argues expressed an environmental double consciousness. So here we get this interesting aspect of certain diasporic writers, especially the older generation. As a young immigrant to England from Trinidad and Tobago, Naipaul famously strove to emulate the English, right, to be more English than English, as he records in his autobiography. As a successor to the, quote, imaginative lineage of English pastoral, unquote, like Constable, painter Constable Gray, from Trinidad and Tobago recalls this is what I think Nixon puts it very nicely, painful dystopian shadow garden of the transatlantic plantation that made that idol possible. I want you to remember that plantation, because when we come to African American writing, we'll talk about that haunts certain African American writers. So environmental historian, well known. In a 1994 book, ecological awareness has been notably ambivalent about its goals, sometimes leaning towards an idealization of nature, Arcadian, that's the term, sort of idea of, an idol, sort of pure nature idea, while also projecting a colonialist attitude to nature. That's what Kate Rigby argues, the philosopher. She's a literary critic, but writes about the history of environmental philosophy. The sociologist Bruno Latour coined the term culture-nature, which is similar to Donna Haraway's nature-culture. So this idea that you can't divorce them. So you can see different scholars thinking along the same wavelengths, as often happens, more or less at the same time, not necessarily directly influenced by me. I know I'm throwing out a lot of terms, but remember, some of this will be in my notes will be provided to the Gian course later. But also, if you think of any, just make down any questions or things we can talk about later. I'd be happy to. Another example is Jamaica Kincaid, the writer who came from Antigua in the Caribbean, tiny island, and emigrated to the U.S. and changed her name. And so she called herself Jamaica. There are different reasons for that. She wasn't from Jamaica, but she wanted to accentuate the Caribbean. And she became a garden columnist not a columnist, but a garden essayist for the New Yorker. And in her famous short volume, anti-tourist volume, A Small Place, excoriated tourism, which is another aspect I would love to talk about, which is on my current topic of pilgrimage, which intersects, but I won't go off there yet. But it does involve environmental. Am I talking too fast? Okay, it's hard, sometimes I carry away. So in an essay in the New Yorker magazine a long time ago called Alien Soil, Kincaid describes her paradoxical situation. If in England she is on alien soil, in her home island of Antigua, where none of the people and few of the plants are native, remember the Philippines example, the soil constitutes the historic ground of her alienation. That's an interesting thing. The ground has been totally changed. So when I say, what is my home ground, that's literal. It's not what it was. So I think that's important to keep in mind. She acknowledges the paradox that although she did not grow up with the luxury of home gardening, which is a luxury, as an adult she learned to cherish this practice that the English had perfected. We could add to this list, Amita Ghosh and many other writers, but I think you get the general idea. So with this broad backdrop in mind, we can address such questions in the week ahead, and also bear in mind such questions as what led writers and thinkers who were mostly based in cities, let's be honest, to be more cognizant of their natural surroundings. What kinds of texts did they produce? And what outlooks characterize these texts? What are some of the prominent tropes that these texts share and why? How have such outlooks, even as they change over time, informed writers around the world and influenced writers around the world, especially with regard to the powerful role human societies have played in reshaping planetary natures and cultures? So those are some of the things to keep in mind. There's also the one question about how have recent critiques of social structures of dominance and oppression, such as in modern colonialism, changed our understanding of how we view and describe nature. So we can also now talk, as even some anthropologists and ecologists do, about colonizing nature, right? So it's not just humans. One of the influential writers early in the day from the American rise of eco-criticism is Lawrence Buell. And in his 1995 book, The Environmental Imagination, Thoreau, Nature, Writing, and the Formation of American Culture, he writes, quote, "The natural environment as empirical reality has been made to subserve human interests, and one of these interests has been made to make it serve as a symbolic reinforcement of the subservience of disempowered groups, non-whites, women, and children." In plain English, in America, especially the settler nation of America, not the indigenous, nature was a key part of its symbolic colonial conquest, and how it was writing about nature to its growing populace. And so that's part of it. And so this depended on subjugation of peoples, right? Groups. And so that's important. And that was in 1995, so that's 30 years ago. He advocates the nurture in that book, the environmental imagination, as he calls it, that combines aesthetics and ethics. That's tough, difficult to do, right? In the reading and interpretation of texts responsive to the natural environment. So post-colonial eco-criticism expands the ethical and historical purview of the environmental imagination, because he had not originally taken into account post-colonial, but he was just starting to. It expands this purview to consider how readers can be attuned to colonialism, environmental justice and racism, economic justice, among other issues, right? And as Graham Huggan and Helen Tiffin put it in their useful book, which is somewhat dated now, 2010, Post-Colonial Eco-Criticism, they say that this study explicitly advocates ethical regard for both the real world it inhabits and the imaginary spaces it opens up. So in this sense, we, at the end of this week, will touch on an area that is not my specialty, which is speculative fiction, climate fiction, because as we know, the imaginative work of writers is key. We don't want to forget that. And how we imagine the future. So I think a lot of leaders and writers, leaders and thinkers today are reading speculative fiction. For example, Obama has advocated it, and some others. I do want to say that post-colonial studies by itself has, you know, always been driven by an ethical drive, a drive for justice, right? To reveal, expose the injustices of colonialism or colonial dynamics, and at the same time to try to effect some change. So now, just to sum up what I've been saying, that impetus now also enters into eco-criticism. So for not to talk about pure ideas like John Muir had in mind, pure landscapes, but to think about how are we colonizing nature, and also who have we displaced in order to create this sort of perfect idea. One of the key words, concepts, and that you, as you know, as we'll see, in American literature is wilderness, but we'll come to that. In terms of post-colonial writers, I think post-colonial critique as a whole heeds the call of writers like the Martinican writers Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire, and the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o to decolonize the mind, right? I was, again, reiterating what I've said. Also, post-colonial criticism, eco-criticism, then calls us to decolonize our thinking about the environment, since we have sought to colonize nature. Animal studies has similarly taken up the lessons of post-colonial studies. So animal studies has been around for quite some time, but with the input of post-colonial critique, then notes the anthropogenic consequences for the planet. So human-made changes to the planet gives us that term that I know you've seen, Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene, it's a debate among scientists whether to accept it. So they recently voted in their big international meeting earlier this year, a year ago, not to accept it, but many do, scientists do. And they say there's no question that humans have shaped the environment, but is it to the extent to call it another era, period, geological? That's another question. But the Anthropocene is something we need to keep in mind. We could also cite the work of the post-colonial critic, who has written on many different areas, but who has shown how uneven economic development in post-colonial periods, uneven economics, has precipitated ecological crises. And I think this applies all over the world now. So building, even in the US, building on wetlands, and then people are surprised that they have flooding, right? When there's a storm that normally the wetlands would have absorbed. Similarly, the environmental literary historian Kate Rigby has pointed out that the human construction of nature, capitalized, has derived from writing systems as early as the Sumerians, so she goes even further back. Rigby argues that we must therefore acknowledge that this construction, like all human events, is never free, she says, from our entanglement with the natural material world. She calls for an I don't know if this will catch on, but an eco-poetics of negativity that emphasizes the inevitable failure that the written word to restore the presence of the natural material. In other words, there's always been a longing to kind of capture the presence of that perfect world, nature that we think of, but we cannot do it. But this can be productive. We can never accurately capture that in writing or any art, but we have to try, right? And I think that's the conclusion they come to. So I'll begin also by looking at some of the romantic poets that I think I had as one of the handouts. I know you may not have had time to read everything, but these are famous poets, so probably have encountered them. And if later on you haven't gotten to the readings, you can read later, right? There's so many, it's such a wide range. So bear with me. So that's the broad overview. So let's look at some specific poems real quickly. And again, I'll fill in some terms, critical terms as we go today. We all know, perhaps, or have at least heard about William Wordsworth's Lines Composed a Few Miles Above the Tintern Head. One of my colleagues is a Wordsworth scholar, so I have to ask him for suggestions. But I'm not going to read all of this, but the part that starts 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, right? And many scholars, including the philosopher Timothy Morton, I'm getting old, so my brain takes a minute to use the database. But Timothy Morton is interesting because he's a philosopher, but he knows his romantic. He has a degree in romanticism too. So he uses, so a lot of writers turn to these kinds of writers as, remember I said there's romantic movement. In English literature, we tend to look at the English romantics, but the Germans really started a generation earlier. And so he's going back, so memory plays a big role here. Recollecting, after all, what is writing? It has to involve memory, right? You're not recording instantly as you go, right? He says down below, once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms, green to the very door. Maybe I should talk with an English accent. With some uncertain choice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods. Now, he says it might seem like there are no houses in the woods, but he's aware that there are people here. Now, this is different from, this is Europe. This is a tiny space in England. This is not, the New World where the settlers are displacing people. But even in Europe, they did this. Or of some hermit's cave where by his fire the hermit sits alone. So we have classic romantic tropes like solitude, the individual reflecting on his or her place in nature, and idealizing nature to some degree, right? Then he says, these beauteous forms through a long absence have not been to me as a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms amid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them an hours of weariness, sensation sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. So the other aspect, of course, is the feelings. It's okay now to talk about feelings at this point in European poetry. So he goes on like this, and it's a beautiful poem. And then he also says just a couple of lines I'd like to read aloud because they are often quoted, or they also perhaps evoke certain themes that I think are important. He talks about a sense of, I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns. So again, I think he's grasping for some connection to nature, right? That's deep. The word sublime, we could talk about. You could also talk about this idea of nature as, in this case, being kind of a material form that elicits psychological reaction. So it's mainly serving the public, right, at this point. So there's nothing wrong. I mean, this is beautiful. We're just reading this from our point of view, that it's not, it's a beginning it's a start to seeing the environment in a new way, but it's got a long way to go. I think you all know about the sublime, but let me just say quickly, in a nutshell, it was a philosophical concept. A lot of people writing, like Edmund Burke in the 1700s, but also was this idea of more than just beauty, it would trigger this paradoxical feeling of awe and human insignificance. Now that's, I think, interesting because I see it revived recently, people using it, right, in post-humanist critique. This idea of we are insignificant, how do we express this? Now, Amitabh Ghosh in The Great Derangement, in his essay 9 years ago, was eloquent as usual, talking about the need to articulate this. He did raise the ire of climate fiction writers because he hasn't read much of that, and he kind of said he never mentioned it a whole lot. But he did make the good point that we are insignificant. Now more than ever, because of climate change, how can we articulate that? That's the great challenge. If that's one thing to take away from this course, where to pick this up? He talks about solitude, fear, pain, grief, Nor perchance if I should be where I no more can hear thy voice, nor catch from thy wild eyes those gleams of past existence. Wilt thou then forget that on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together, that I, so long a worshipper of nature, he capitalizes nature, hither came unwearied in that service, and then he ends by saying, talking about this green pastoral landscape. Right now, he's talking about his sister Dorothy, but it struck me that this idea of he doesn't mention her directly. Right? He says my companion, and you can read this in other ways as well. And it caught my attention that on Andamat by Bankim Chandra, there's also this disembodied voice. Now that tends to be the divine voice, but there's something about people who, these romantics, when they go out in nature, sometimes it's just a purely metaphorical voice. Here, I think you can read it as both the voice of his sister and metaphorical. Does that make sense? But he's not religious per se, he's more spiritual. Whereas Bankim Chandra was more religious. But I think you can see Bankim Chandra had been influenced by the romantics, I think, there. It's my view, to some degree. So we'll come back to that. So these are the cross sections that are here. But aside from that, just keep in mind, sublime, solitude, these things. Now that will inform John Muir's view, for example, of wilderness. It tended to be, not surprisingly, a male view. And even John Muir, even up until only the 20th century, was predominantly male. Men had this sort of liberty to roam around, right? And men usually get lost, so that maybe was part of it. But I'm just joking. But this idea that that Muir would invoke these sort of the same ideas, the sublime. Even though he wasn't a poet, but he was a good writer. Okay, how much time? From an enchanter fleeing. It's very interesting, right? To think about when you look at it in light of this sort of, here's someone trying to respond to nature, and why choose these particular things? And I think and then he says something that sounds very much like he's read about it or something. He says, wild spirit which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver. Right? So there you start to see sort of these clues to the sense that they have been inspired by the translations that were fairly recent from Indian works. That's fascinating. He also talks about, I'm just reading these to give us a sense. If I were a dead leaf, thou mightest bear. If I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, right? Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. Again, trying to enter that, this idea, as Wordsworth did, connecting with nature. So these are important because if you think of it in a literary history, how they inform later writers. We have Coleridge. You all know this, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. But again, I think one way to read it is that it's a transgression against nature. That's one way to read it. You don't have to read it that way, but that enriches our understanding of it. And I think so that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so I think we started at 11:15, so we still have about 15-20 minutes. So I know it's a long time to sit, so if you need to stretch, please do so. Try not to yawn, but no. So American Romantics and Transcendentals. So James Fenimore Cooper, writing, he lived from 1789 to 1851. Some of you may know this. If not, it's an interesting piece of literary history. He wrote The Last of the Mohicans and a lot of those kinds of, he called them the Deerslayer novels based on his main character. And he was a best-selling writer in Europe because he had imbibed those romantic ideals. But here's now where we get to the American side that's been very influential. That's why I mentioned it, but I'm glad we're getting away from that these days. For a long time it was influential, where the idea of a wilderness, for example, first of all, the romanticization of the noble savage. You know, that's the idea of the noble savage, right? That Rousseau had talked about. And so this idea that it's a condescending view of the native, of the indigenous, that they're in touch with nature. I think we still have that a lot, I'm sorry to say. A lot of our works of literary criticism, everywhere in the world, I see it. This idea that, oh yes, they're in touch with nature. But it's more like you're objectifying them, you're not really humanizing them, and as if they don't have an agency of their own. So I'm just generalizing. So anyway, he was very famous for that. So but it's always a white European guy, settler, who masters, you know this, masters the indigenous thinking more than the indigenous, so can traverse both the European sort of civilized sector as well as this noble savage. Does that might make it? Anyway, we'd love to talk about it more. But here's what he says, just as snippets, to give you a sense, right? On that day, and this is prose, this is a novel, it's very fast moving, right? On that day, two men were lingering on the banks of a small but rapid stream, within an hour's journey of the encampment when, like those who awaited the appearance of an absent person or the approach of some unexpected event, the vast canopy of woods spread itself to the margin of the river, overhanging the water and shadowing its dark current with a deeper hue. The rays of the sun were beginning to grow less fierce, and the intense heat of the day was lessened as the cooler vapors of the springs and fountains rose above their leafy beds and rested in the atmosphere. It sounds very nice, right? Jungle retreat. Still that breathing silence which marks the drowsy sultriness of an American landscape. That begs a lot of questions. In July, now he's also writing for an Eastern U.S. audience, also European and Eastern, which had been settled. This is supposed to take place in the forested areas. Pervaded the secluded spot, interrupted only by the low voices of man, the occasional and lazy tap of a woodpecker, the discordant cry of some gaudy jay, so a bird, or a swelling on the ear from the dull roar of a distant waterfall. So again, this idea of being in this pristine environment, and you could argue, oh, well, he's advocating for protection of this, but that's not really so. He's talking about the fact that the settlers are, when he says American, he doesn't mean Native American. He does mean that it might incorporate some of their ideas, because the Americans wanted to be distinct from Europe. They were still fine. This was when they were starting to become more confident in their writing, after some decades. And he goes on and talks about, then he talks about the Native American. His body, which was nearly naked, presented a terrific emblem of death, drawn in intermingled colors of white and black. His closely shaped head, on which no other hair than the well-known and chivalrous sculpting tuft was preserved, was without ornament of any kind, with the exception of a solitary eagle's plume. And he goes on to talk, sort of an objectification of the native. Now, it's ironically, I think you know, I don't know if you know, there was 30 years ago some film version of Last of the Mohicans with Daniel Day-Lewis. So you get these kind of weird, he's also, white men playing sort of these subliminal figures. So that's Cooper. So I want to keep Cooper in mind because some of the, arguably some of the early Indian nationalist writers starting in 1930s, like DeRosio, had written, right, argued. We don't know direct evidence, but the British allowed certain novels to be published in India, and Cooper was one of those, but I don't know directly. But even if it's secondhand, they get these ideas. Then we get Henry David Thoreau talking about. I mentioned. He says, "I went to the woods." Famous opening. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. Beautiful, elegant, powerful. But he also talks in other parts, you could hear the train whistle. Walden is not, this was a place in Connecticut that was the closest he could come. He had an opportunity to go to this place. He's not going too far beyond civilization. He's not going to live purely on his own, and he doesn't claim to. And I think it's still a powerful piece of writing. But it's interesting to think and keep in our mind that he could hear civilization right there. And he talks about the sublime, whether he would find this, and he goes on to read. And then he, of course, as I said, he often quotes the Upanishads and other things. And he famously says, "Still we live meanly," meaning we humans, "like ants. Though the fable tells us that we were long ago changed into men, like pygmies we fight with cranes. It is error upon error and clout upon clout, and our best virtue has for its occasion a superfluous and inevitable wretchedness. Our life is frittered away by detail." I'm thinking, boy, he had not seen anything yet. I mean, that's what he thought in the 1840, 49, right? And we think, oh, people were less commercialized then? Not really. I mean, I think relatively less, but they were still aware of, I think the fact is that if he were alive today, it'd be interesting to think about what he would say. So anyway, that's Thoreau. Another part of this survey is Ralph Waldo Emerson, who talks about, Leo Marx is a critic who talks about The Machine in the Garden, an influential American work on the title, I think, metaphorically says it, "The Machine Industry Entering the Garden Landscape." But he too has a kind of idealized view of nature. But this is what Nathaniel Hawthorne writes, who authored The Scarlet Letter and those texts, right? Also very much in tune with nature, And one of the progenitors of a distinctly American literary taste and style, more than, and subject matter. He says, but this is Hawthorne, "But hark, there's the whistle of the locomotive, the long shriek, harsh above all other harshness. For the space of a mile cannot modify it into harmony. It tells a story of busy men, citizens from the hot street, who have come to spend a day in a country village, men of business. In short, of all unquietness. And no wonder that it gives such a startling shriek, since it brings the noisy world into the midst of our slumbrous peace." So again, this idea of, as the Romantics have it, the invasion of nature. And then we go on and talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson, but I'll go on, and I just want to give the snippet and closing of this survey of John Muir. Now, he wrote many things, and this one is a snippet from A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf, which was a journal that he kept in 1867, so it was an early piece when he was younger, and it wasn't published until 1916, after he had died. So, he says, the live oaks, and he went down to southeastern U.S. to Florida, things like that. The live oaks of these keys divide empire with the long-leafed pine and palmetto, but in many places on the mainland, There are large tracts exclusively occupied by them. Like the Bonaventure oaks, they have the upper side of their main spreading branches thickly planted with ferns, grasses, small saw palmettos, etc. There's a dwarf oak here, which forms dense thickets. The oaks of this key, that is the Florida Keys, these islands, like those of the Wisconsin openings, growing on grassy slopes, but stand sunk to the shoulders in flowering magnolias, heathworts, etc. Now, this is a journal, so he does a lot of etc. And then just one more line. The world, we are told, was made especially for man, a presumption not supported by all the facts. So here, Muir does sound like he's saying we have to accept nature on its own terms. So he was ahead of his times in that. It's not just for humans. But in creating, he never talks about the native barriers, right? That's the paradox. So he's typical of this product of his times. Even Thoreau does not. And so, of course, we're reading them in hindsight, but still, it's a notable absence. So I want to pause there, and we just have a couple more minutes. I know I haven't, let's see, see how far I'm getting in this first lecture. Yeah, so I am going to go and come back to some of the key parts of key terms in eco-criticism. But before we have about 3 or 4 minutes of this first lecture, I want to touch on some of those very quickly. In the modern eco-critical environmental writing, that is modern sense of awareness, because nature writing has been there forever, but in the modern sense of awareness of pollution, about humans polluting the world, of course, the main person who comes to mind is Rachel Carson in 1962, right? Silent Spring, which led directly to governments discontinuing things like DDT. It took a few years. And she was a scientist as well as an eloquent writer, which made it a bestseller. And she was also not taken seriously because she was female at the time. That quickly changed, I think. But I love how this starts. And in case you're new to it, it's a wonderful way to teach it as well. She starts with a 3-page opening called A Fable for Tomorrow that you may be familiar with. And again, it's fable-like. There was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings, and invoking the ancient tradition of the pastoral, goes on to paint a picture of prosperous farms, green fields, foxes barking in the hills, silent deer, ferns and wildflowers, countless birds, and trout. And I'm summarizing some of this. They all delighted in, were all delighted in by those who passed through the town. And then she says, so it's an invasion motif. So we have an ideal town. She says this is like once upon a time. And then she says, then a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Some evil smell had settled upon the community. Mysterious maladies swept the flocks of chickens, the cattle and sheep sickened and died. Everywhere was a shadow of death. And that's it's so poetic. Then she says, a little below, on the mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, catbirds, doves, jays, wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was no sound. Only silence lay over fields and woods and marsh. So what we get here, one thing to maybe, I haven't gone through everything in this literature, but I hope to in lecture 1, is the genres of pastoralism on the one hand and apocalyptic literature on the other hand, that she doesn't know she's invoking a genre, but it's this notion that comes from religious writings, for example, the idea of apocalypse, right? But now invoked in modern, everyday America. So we have the pastoralism, she says she's not saying it was real, but it was certainly she's trying to grab people's attention. And that's how you grab a reader's attention. And then you have this apocalypse that comes, and she actually invokes, she cites John Keats's poem, that Ben Gone sung Merci. She says, in which magical power of a beautiful woman lights the environment. This is Keats. The sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing. So she uses that to talk about, right, to capture people's imagination as well. So I think that's wonderful. So I can maybe start the next lecture with invoking a couple of these other writers like Vandana Shiva and so forth. But this idea that we have pastoralism and apocalypse, we also have toxic discourse. That's the time. Is that the time for the end of the lecture? Is it just in my head? No. I think it is toxic. The toxic discourse we can talk about. She didn't coin that term. Lawrence Beale coined it many years later in the 1990s, but that fits with what she was doing. So we've come a long way. We made a big survey, right? And I'll conclude this lecture there. I think it's been exactly 1 hour, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure if finished. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. We're no Q&A now. Later. Thank you. Yeah.
फिर वापस रिज्यूम कर देंगे। इसी पे चलने दीजिए, मैंने यही लिंक भेज दिया था उनको। इसी लिंक पे चलने दीजिए, चल जाएगा ना इस लिंक? हाँ बिल्कुल चलो। हाँ, अगर आप चाहें तो मैं इसके बाद भी कंटिन्यू कर सकती हूँ। वापस भेज तो दूर की है।
Hello, clear?
Hello, 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 hello. हेलो 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 लगा सकते हैं क्या सर केक उधर पे?
हाँ लगा सकते हैं, उनसे बात कर लीजिए।
Testing? Okay.
If you can't hear, please come closer. Use the chairs that are closer to sir so that you can hear. And in case of the sound is not reaching you.
Oh.
So if you want to shift the side, you can. Please settle down, everybody. We will be starting again. Please shift closer to sir. If you are not able to hear, please move closer.
Okay, welcome. This is lecture 2 of the Gian course on post-colonial eco-criticism. And the first part of this, we were doing a survey and having a lot of names and so forth, and we may still encounter a number of names of critics as well as writers. I did not have time at the end of the last lecture as planned to talk about just 3 representative Native American writers, so I may get to them later, but I did want to mention that indigenous perspective because I think moving forward. So one was Linda Hogan, who is a poet and essayist, and notice that each of these writers represent do use the word tribe, but some places they may not. So Linda Hogan talks about, for example, the dog wants, did you take a life you didn't eat? Right? And so that's obviously a direct criticism of the settler notion. So I wanted to mention these indigenous views, and she also says that, and I think this is an important perspective that we can all learn from. It has been my lifelong work to seek an understanding of the 2 views of the world, one Native American, Native people, and the others who are new and young on this continent. It is clear that we have strayed from the treaties we once had with the land and with the animals. It is also clear and disheartening that in our time there are many, Indian and non-Indian alike, who want to restore and honor those broken agreements. So the Native American perspective, just as whether in Canada or America, in Canada they prefer the term First Nation, that perspective is about broken agreements, right, which was often the case, about displacement, disease, and so they're still living with that legacy. Another one is Simon Ortiz, who is Pueblo, from southeastern U.S. And I was lucky enough to hear each of these poets. That's why I chose them at different times, read their poetry. He says, people are not born, they are made when they become human beings within ritual, tradition, purpose, responsibility. So they're not born human. That's a fascinating concept, right? It goes against everything that sort of a European modern outlook, or we might even say just modern outlook has. And then Joy Harjo, who is Muskogee Creek, notice these very specific terms, talks about, here a poem, Granddaughters. I emerged from my mother's river on my father's boat of potent fever. Interesting. Like Hogan, she refers to starts conveying a mythic ethos. The planets, cave, moon, fish, wing, deerskin, and skins, these are parts of the words I'm taking out of the poems I assigned, all reflect a close connection of the Native American speaker to their natural surroundings. But I think the point to take away here is that these are modern writers, so they have a kind of double consciousness, right? They are looking, trying to balance the traditional, but they're so. The other writers that I did not have time to mention, some are writers, nonfiction creative writers, some are scholars, are Aldo Leopold, whose Sand County Almanac of 1949 was very important. He talked about the land ethic. The book is a kind of hybrid of poetic description, natural observation, philosophical reflections, almost in the form of a journal, and kind of in the tradition of Thoreau, exactly 100 years later, and was equally, I think, influential. By land ethic, he basically means a thing is right, these are his words, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So an ethic, again, what Native American indigenous peoples have said all along is to make a compact with nature. Don't harm nature more, don't use it more than you need to survive. So that land ethic could be seen as a modern way of articulating an indigenous sensibility. But I think one thing that also made his book influential, like Rachel Carson, hers was even more influential, is that they have a scientific background. So but they are poets in a sense, right? And that's a rare combination. Another woman, critic that I wanted to mention was Annette Kolodny's The Lay of the Land, 1975. This book was famous for, this was 50 years ago now, was famous for talking about how the colonization of land depended on seeing the land as female, both in sexual and reproductive ways, but also maternal ways. Now, on the surface, there's nothing wrong with most cultures in the world have seen nature as maternal, Mother Nature, on the surface. And to a degree, there's nothing wrong. But if that is combined with a kind of objectification of women and also women as expedients, they're only there to nurture the men, then that's a problem. So it depends on what context. It's interesting that in the Western United States, where my university is, it's maybe very close to this Yellowstone Park. It's not far from another park that's called the Tetons. I won't say what the Tetons, T-E-T-O-N, was a French word because there were a lot of French explorers in that area. in the 1700s. And I can't say it here, but if you look up what the word Teton means, it's a sexual image, and no one knows that who lives in that area, because they just know English, and they just think Tetons, yeah. It's a famous park. It's beautiful. But French trappers, men, after months in the wilderness, came upon these mountains and gave them a reference that is sexual reference to women. That's not, I often tell my students that, and they've never heard that, right? So that illustrates what Annette Kolodny is saying. And then, I think one of the points that applies to all of these talks, another point is, as you know from post-colonial critique, essentialism. So the idea of thinking that something has an integral essence that cannot be changed. This sometimes becomes part of a nationalist view. It can become part of a racial view. It becomes part of a gendered view. But I think this idea that land had a sort of essence that, first of all, that could not be changed, and secondly, that it was there to be used by, in American case, the white settlers, is a problem because land always changes. That's another thing we should learn. Land always changes. The peoples know this, right? They don't have a static view of land. They have a more fluid way of looking at both the boundaries between living peoples and others. So that's another thing that Annette Kolodny, she doesn't take an indigenous point of view. It's more feminist, but all of these writers together. And then finally, Mahashweta Devi and Vandana Shiva's work, and so they perhaps need no introduction, but I think Vandana Shiva, again, is very influential, 1988 book, Staying Alive, Women, Ecology, and Development, and has been incredibly influential in helping, because of her PhD in the history of science, to help expose some of the multinationals like Monsanto. And I was just reading about Roundup. Do you know what Roundup is? Roundup is a brand name used by an American company for a pesticide that you could spray in your yard, and it has glyphosate, something like that. Don't ask me, but the point is she helped steer the world towards getting that banned. So Monsanto has had to pay hundreds of millions of dollars for that, for the victims. I just saw in my hometown a billboard saying, "Help farmers preserve glyphosate." In other words, they want to, they said Roundup, save Roundup. Because they say, well, if we don't use Roundup, we can't grow our fields, which is a very narrow way of looking at things. So this is real stuff. Now, how does this influence literature? We can talk about that. Okay. So what I'd like to do in this lecture too is start with the Columbian Exchange again, and that I alluded to in my very broad opening. And this is what we talk about, the exchange not just of foods, but of ideas, diseases, right? Crops and populations. So the so-called, they still tend to use the terms old world and new world. It's just a handy reference, but it's kind of interesting terminology. And that is this is Alfred Crosby who coined it in 1972. But he talks about how we think about sometimes a benign Columbian exchange. In other words, just foods, right? But as we know, the other thing that happened was one of the reasons that the European settlers could, with small numbers, take over was smallpox and other diseases that the Native Americans had no immunization against. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And this then becomes in the handling of another, well, he also coined the term ecological imperialism, right? There is another critic I'll come to later who talks more about that, and that is Richard Grove, who has a book called Green Imperialism, which you might find interesting. But I read a book a long time ago, before I did eco-criticism, called Plagues and Peoples by McNeill, a historian, and talks about how diseases shaped history. So now what we see is all the coming together of these different disciplines, right? To say, how do they, and you can see in these native indigenous writers, how they talk about these effects. So even though their ancestors died out, who bore the brunt of this hundreds of years ago, they still live with that, right? Partly because Native America, here's the other part of this, indigenous populations tend to preserve, still, to some degree, oral cultures. And I think that's the other part of this to keep in mind. And Amitav Ghosh does a good job of trying to represent that, as do a lot of Native American writers. So this idea of the orality, the orature of traditions, which had been denigrated. So let's talk about some, perhaps this might be a good place to talk about some key concepts in eco-criticism. And I'm just going to go through some of these terms, and then I'll look at how I have applied them to a reading of The Hungry Tide, right? In addition to some other works. So we talked about toxic discourse, right? One of those terms. Another one would be a term that I mentioned, Annette Kolodny, this idea of ecofeminism. So looking at, trying to look critically at how male writers have depicted nature, right? That's an important one. There's also something called new materialism, which tends to have been used by a lot of feminist writers, but it doesn't have to be. And that gives equal agency to not only nature, but objects. So things. Now you say, how can objects have agency? But it's a way to decenter human privilege, the priority of humans, to decenter humans. If you know the theorists, Deleuze and Guattari, for example, this idea of rhizomatic, these are just one of many. There's also Jane Bennett, who is a philosopher, really, talks about object ontology. So basically what she means, she talks about how, can we talk about how things have place, for example, the land, does it have agency, right? If we are giving agency, that could have legal ramifications as well. So I like this word entangled, which comes up a lot, which is that we are entangled in a web of both a sentient world, sentient meaning something that, or an organism that lives and responds to nature, right, and with some kind of sensibility, versus a non-sentient world, but also a world of objects. And this is what Timothy Morton calls also a mesh. It doesn't matter which term you use, entangled or mesh, right? There are many synonyms for these, but these are the two ones that seem to come up a lot. And that's the idea that we are entangled in this, right? There's an interesting anthropologist named Eduardo Kohn, Kohn, who talks about a book called Do Forests Think? And so he studies an Amazonian tribe. It becomes very philosophical and dense. But the basic idea is to say, can we give agency to not just non-human animals, but also trees, things like that. A wonderful book, if you're interested, is called The Overstory by Richard Powers. It came out in 2019, and I just taught it for the first time earlier this year. It's a wonderful way to think about trees having agency. The other term that comes up we've talked about is pastoral, right? So what is pastoral? So it comes from this word, it's related to the word pasture, right? So it comes from the idea of shepherding animals. So we talk about, for example, ecologists talk about pastoral peoples, right, who have goats or livestock of some sort. But pastoralism, especially in the Western context, has this idea of, it tends to be a view, these are fancy words, I know I'm throwing a lot of words, a declensionist view. That is a narrative of decline. The fancy word is post-lapsarian. All this means is that there was a perfect time, and this is informed sometimes by religious, Christian, Judeo-Christian ideas, that there was a perfect time and we have fallen. Now a lot of these writers are not even religious. That's not the point. The point is it diffuses the culture, and it says, that's the Romantics too. They say, we'll never really get back to what we were, right? You know, that's a kind of notion that Native Americans don't subscribe to, ironically. You might think they would because they have seen their culture destroyed. But they never saw it as a linear view where, oh, there was a golden age and now we're, you know, as if we'll never get back there. That's a very sort of interesting way of looking at it. So I think this idea of, if you think of Paradise Lost, right? Humans have lapsed. That was the word that they preferred. And they have fallen. That word comes up a lot. And notice how Rachel Carson uses that very cleverly, right, to talk in certain ways. So when we say pastoralism, we tend to think of a kind of word like paradise, kind of, if you're talking about it in literature, which is interesting because we know paradise comes from Persian. It means a planned garden, right? A secure sanctuary, paradiso. So, but this idea that we have a pastoral eye, so sometimes that's why so much writing can become, it's hard to write about environment without sounding sentimental, or maybe the word is flowery, you know, sort of trite. It's talking about, oh, how beautiful the flowers are. Now that's fine. We get that in a different context in Kalidasa's Shakuntala, which beautiful, right? Now I don't read the original Sanskrit, as some of you may, but it's still beautiful, you can see. So that's not in and of itself a problem. The problem is if you don't have a context in which to, if that's the only discourse you're looking at. So pastoralism, then, and by the way, the key text for introducing eco-criticism is a very useful one by Greg Girard. It's in its third edition, right? So that's if you're interested. Wilderness, we've talked about that. So I have taught, to give you an idea of how humans have, most writing has come from cities. So if even in ancient times, the earliest recorded epic is Gilgamesh, Sumerian, on clay tablets. That is, that we know of, you know, that's been discovered. 5,500 years old or something. It's about the city of Uruk that uses up all the cedar forest, right, to make its fancy doors and all. So they knew what they were doing. So here we have an idea of wilderness as wild, as the first part of that word suggests. but at the same time, pure as Gilgamesh's partner. If you read the epic, it's not very long. Enkidu is created for to be his helpmate. Gilgamesh is the king who has to he's searching for meaning in life, basically, and immortality. He finds that he can't do it. He was a bad king. So the gods create Enkidu, who's a natural man. And so he's very wild. He's hairy and so forth. So you already see from early on certain ideas, the kernels of this idea of city, civilization versus wild, wilderness. In North America, then, that becomes, as I've said, this idea of seeing wilderness as kind of sublime and there to be enjoyed by certain settler peoples. The other term, these are by chapters in Girard because I think they're useful, is apocalypse. We've talked about that, so we'll come back to that, which includes toxic discourse. We don't have to talk about all the science fiction films and things like that, post-apocalyptic, whatever you want to call it, fascinating stories. It's interesting to me that some of the feminist writers today, like Margaret Atwood and so on, are doing the more effective post-apocalyptic writing, because that's going to change how society works. Right? Animals. Peter Berger in 1980 talked about why look at animals in a famous essay, and how we objectify animals, and I know a lot of writers have said how we remove them from, on the one hand, if you look at the pet industry, for example, how pets are sort of infantilized and looked at very fondly, but on the other hand, we may be kind of careless about how other animals are treated. So he talked about that, but there's this idea of anthropomorphism and zoomorphism, where you represent animals with humans or animals with animal characteristics in art and media. Indigeneity, we've talked about, and then finally the earth as Gaia. I think, have you encountered that? So the idea of Gaia coming from the ancient Greek goddess idea that James Lovelock, a scientist actually in the 1970s, a British scientist, suggested that we talk about as if the planet is one organism. Even if it's not, even if, whatever you think, it's useful to think of it as a thought experiment, because then you say everything's interconnected, right? And so Gaia, G-A-I-A. Okay. So now to come to The Hungry Tide, as I mentioned, I would do a short reading. And again, I'll have to shorten this to some degree. And I'm mindful of looking at a number of writers that we may not get to in Lecture 2. Besides The Hungry Tide, there's Aranyak, which is Vibhuti Bhushan's famous Bengali novel. Days and Nights in the Forest, right? Aranyak Din Ratri, right? Ken Saro-Wiwa, famous Nigerian writer. And then one writer that was new to me is Jangwanga Dema. I wanted to get someone new, young. She's from Botswana but lives in England, so we can talk about that. Again, we may not get to all of these, so keep in mind. So here's my reading of Hungry Tide. So it's set in the Sundarbans, of course, and is among the most studied texts in modern eco-criticism. But because it's clearly an eco-critique, and because it is part of the wide, far-ranging oeuvre of a major writer who insistently decenters dominant worldviews, and who compels readers to see that these worldviews cannot be understood without recognizing their interconnection with the natural environment. And I should add, he loves history, right, and the historicizing of this. Ghosh himself identifies this theme in The Great Derangement, as I mentioned, which is subtitled Climate Change and the Unthinkable. It was while visiting the Sundarbans as he worked on the Hungry Tide, he writes, that he, quote, became aware of the urgent proximity of non-human presences, unquote. This was partly because, he says, the landscape of the Sundarbans is, quote, so dynamic, remember the changing landscape, that its very changeability leads to innumerable moments of recognition, such as the fact that it is demonstrably alive, and that's his phrase, and not an inert, quote, stage for the enactment of human history. So most places have been, like even the Romantic poets, the setting is really a stage for human self-perception and reflection and so forth. How do we write about nature where nature itself is important, just as important, right? It's not there for being used by humans. Now, that understandably, we are the humans writing this, so it's going to be mediated through our view. We can't avoid that. But he wants to try, as some other writers do, as Richard Powers tries to do. He also noticed the portents, the signs, the omens. He uses the word portents, that the forests were enduring irreversible change due to global warming. The Sundarbans is itself a protagonist in the story of environmental, the word protagonist he uses, the story of environmental changes and human relationships to them, but Ghosh observes that he would not have perceived these truths unless, quote, some prior awareness of what I was witnessing had not already been implanted in me in childhood. So he credits some kind of notion of this idea of nature being having its own existence, and changeable and agency, to something in his childhood. And he suggests that perhaps family lore of the ancestors had been forced to, had been at work here. And he says that the story enabled him to recognize that his ancestors, this is quote, were ecological refugees long before the term was invented. That's fascinating, right? So we discount the number of, now we're living in the greatest migrations in human history. We forget that, right? Wars are part of that. Wars then, of course, destroy nature, landscapes, as in Palestine or wherever. So, but we also have so much history of that, even from Bangladesh, the war and refugees, and climate migration is going to be even bigger now. It's already happening. So in the U.S., after Hurricane Katrina, 2010, I think it was, or 11 in New Orleans, the city is only half the population it used to be. It's still a nice city. I was there a few years ago, but it's only half. So that's happening. Where are the other people going, right? So watch out for that. Also, risk theory. Insurance companies are no longer insuring in America for forest fires, for fire, or flood in many places. They say, well, we can't afford it. That's an index of what's happening, right? So as Ghosh writes in The Hungry Tide, in the voice of a character named Nilima, boats are finding it increasingly hard to traverse the Sundarbans waterways because, quote unquote, there isn't much water in the river nowadays. So in his depiction of the Sundarbans, mangrove forest, Ghosh adds a crucial element missing in other writers' descriptions of the regions, including Rushdie, who has what is a small section in The Midnight's Children. Many writers have used, set not maybe tiny scenes in the Sundarbans, or have talked about forests in general. But what Ghosh does is the reality of drastic anthropogenic changes, right? He gives us a sense of how the Sundarbans region has been administered by both colonial and nation-state authorities, both of whom view the area's inhabitants as intruders, into a generically wild environment, rather than, as he shows, people who live within what Eduardo Kohn, the anthropologist, calls an ecology of selves. So there's not this integral single self. It's hard to comprehend, I know. But we only have identity in terms of a community. That's how a lot of indigenous people see themselves. Ghosh does not romanticize these inhabitants, whose forebears, in fact, mostly arrived in the 19th century. He instead illustrates, through characters whose childhood depends upon this watery world, how comparatively detached most people, including his readers, excuse me, have become from the natural world. It is they, we, who preserve the wild civilized duality. The Sundarbans inhabitants, as Anu Jale concludes in her close study of the region, and she also is a friend of Ghosh, and he learned from her work. She concludes in her study that they have a deep understanding of the relatedness to an environment that is harsh for humans, but that the dominant groups are not listening to. So now, here's where I come to some important points, I believe. As we know, the indigenous people in the Sundarbans, if we're looking still at this case study, rely on fishing and gathering honey, wild honey. So fishing, those are the main ones. There are others. Honey and beeswax, right? Both of which expose them to attacks by the region's Royal Bengal tiger. To help readers gain some understanding of this mutually respectful human-environment relationship, he flourishes a number of narrative devices, including folk songs, staged dramas, animal calls, one character's diary, and the motif of translation, right? So he uses quite a number of different tactics, so the folk traditions of the Bon Bibi myth and so forth. And he wants, we want to keep this idea on seeing things anew. The motif of sight becomes powerful, right? I've argued that, and I don't know how convincing this is, but so there's a character named, a lot of you have read this, or many, not everyone. There's a character named Kannai, who's the Kolkata, he's the translator, right? He's very urbane, he's scornful of, he's not particularly, he's very urban. He's somewhat scornful of these local traditions. He's even skeptical, he's a bit misogynistic a little bit with Pia, the cetologist who's studying dolphins. And there's a guy named Fokir who's the local, he does the fishing boat, and he has his boat, right? And he's been hired to take them to this island, to an excursion to look for the Irrawaddy dolphin. But Fokir gets so annoyed at Kannai that he pretends to abandon him on one of the islands in the mud banks. Well, the way I look at it is if you read that, the whole section is called A Pilgrimage. This reflects my current project. But it relates to this in the sense that the motif of sight I was talking about, you start to see that motif everywhere because Kannai, he gets so frightened about the tiger, possibly, because they see the paw mark. And Fokir knows what he's doing, right? But Kannai, he's just terrified, and he kind of half loses consciousness. He almost faints. And he has kind of epiphany. So he sees, somehow he sees something new, an experience of nature. He's on the mud bank, and then he wipes the mud from his eyes. It's very symbolic. And when he does that, he sees, he's still angry at Fokir, but he's a little humbled. Does that make sense? So I argue that this is one way in which a writer, an imaginative writer, talks about And it's not, no magic realism involved or anything. It's just saying how Kannai, who's very skeptical, has to learn the hard way to appreciate nature and Fakir's knowledge of it in a way that makes him more sensitive to this changeable environment, because the mud bank also changes constantly. And so it questions this whole idea of empirical knowledge and purely empirical. So Pia too has to learn this. She's the protagonist, who's the dolphin expert. She's using GPS, but Fakir kind of knows more how to find the dolphin than the GPS. So we get these kinds of things going on. And I think that the way in which translation works from an eco-critical lens is that ultimately what these writers are doing is trying to translate that, a sense of that natural world and human connection to it, to the reader, right? So it's not just translating language, but maybe we might say the language of nature more broadly. Does that make sense? So I think there are different ways to read this. We also know that, as I said, he does not romanticize this, because we do have the villagers killing a tiger, right? A leopard, but it's ambiguous whether it's a leopard or a tiger, and because it's threatening their lives, right? So, and we also have the famous Moric Japi sad massacre episode, which again talks about that dilemma of we want to save animals because we've encroached on their world so much. This is all over the world. So now what do? We want to have a preserve for them, but then if we want a certain preserve, we may have to move people. Is that ethical, right? To save the animal? I don't know. Okay. Excuse me. The another thing that I think that the Hungry Tide does, and other writers' books do, is talks about the correspondence between language and landscape. I talked about wilderness and how we often create in our imaginations, right? For all practical purposes, it becomes real to us. We create a landscape by describing it, right? And that's how other people read about it. And then, because if you want to go visit a famous forest reserve, you read about it, right? You may get photos, but it's still translated for you. So this correspondence of how humans construct nature. Now, we don't want to have, excuse me, I'm getting a scratchy throat, but we don't want to talk about I don't at least subscribe to this idea of pure constructiveness. That is, it's not that language creates everything that's real. There is real nature there. The question is, to what degree do we unlearn the biases, the myths that the modern world inculcates in us? To what degree do we unlearn that so we can understand the workings of nature, right? That we have lost. And I think, again, listening to indigenous peoples is a key part of that. I'm going to skip ahead here to so if we turn to the you can see some correspondences between the Hungry Tide that are interesting and Aranyak, which is the 1930s novel, which I read in translation, of course, by Vibhuti Bhushan. We have the same, and we also see it a bit in the Gangopadhyay's novel about Days and Nights in the Forest, where this kind of idealization of nature, how the relationship between the characters, the main characters, and their preconceived notions of nature shapes them as compared to their every actual experience. For example, you might say that in Aranyak, as I note in other places, I've written about this in my book, the narrator compares a young tribal man to a sal tree, right? So that's a very, but that's done without a sense of irony. In other words, the narrator presumably thinks this is a favorable comparison. But to compare an indigenous person to a tree, as much as you might respect the tree, is problematic, right? Because again, you're naturalizing the native peoples and disallowing agency because it assumes that they are just exactly the same as a tree. So I think you can see some of that Ghosh is responding to that and trying to make us unlearn those ways of preconceiving the environment. I think that's very hard because, especially for environments we don't know well, how do we know them? We have to read about them. We have to look at images of them. One of the things that, and then I'll just close by looking at, let's see. Yeah, we still have to go through Sarawiwa. So I'm going to close this section on sort of the, if I may, the Indian section of these examples by talking about how Aranyak, the other thing that comes up is that like The Home in the World by Tagore, this involves either as an undercurrent, maybe not explicitly, or sometimes explicitly stated the zamindar system. And so how this idea of land ownership and stewardship relates to class and things like that. This is what we might call environmental justice, as well as the land. Is environmental justice, does it depend on the land ethic? If so, then ultimately that means that land cannot be monetized. Land cannot be given $1 or rupee value. It's hard to see in a world today where that is going to be undone. But at least it's worth thinking about, because that was what the Native Americans, for example, were taken advantage of because they did not understand that concept. Like how can you own the land, right? That has become naturalized in our world, as if, well, of course you can own land. But no, that's not a natural point. So this idea of the zamindar system is under this, behind this, and there's the subtitle that's given is Of the Forest, which essentially translates the Bangla word Aranyak, but this decision for translation suggests a couple of things in the English translation I read. And that is that some words, it suggests that why would they preserve the Sanskrit word for Aranyak? This seems like a small point, right, in the English translation. But again, it's a way to sort of perhaps essentialize the original manuscript, right? We could say. But it also points to again, whether you agree or not with that, it points to this idea of how language affects how we see the land, because of course, this also refers to the books of the forest, right? Book of the forest in the Mahabharata and other things that these writers come to these texts with. Does that make sense? So they're just as all these words invoke a history of other associations that we then have to unpack. Does that make sense? So that if you're talking about, for example, if I use the word wilderness, I can no longer use that innocently, right? It comes today with a history. Does that make sense? So in the same way, I think Aranyak you have to read it in the context of a South Asian perspective, perhaps, or an Indian perspective. I'll just say this one phrase. I don't know, I checked it to read if there was time, but In describing the cruelties of the colonial state's mantra of progress, which depends to a large degree on deforestation. Now, this is written in the 1930s, so it's the British colonial state. The narrator is haunted by his certainty that these forests he loves will not stand for long. So again, we have this idea of a threat invoked to the forest in Bengal, and this idea that the novel is, for this reason, perhaps a confessional. It's about a man who goes and serves as, this forest officer, and he sees anew how we have to preserve this forest. And it concludes with the narrator lamenting his role in destroying forests, the memories of which still haunt him. So there's a sense of guilt in participating in that. I'm going to skip forward here now to, which is a long section in the notes, and talk about briefly Gangopadhyay's Days and Nights in the Forest. Another way to look at these is to look at them in literary history. And I'm not giving a plot summaries here. Those will be in the notes if you're interested. And you can look those up online. And we'll look at Ray's a tiny clip from Ray's version, film version of this. But if you look at this as a part of India's, chronologically, you have Ananda Math, which I know I haven't talked about, but in 1882, and The Home in the World, 1906 or thereabouts, or something like that. And then you have Aranyak, and then you have Days and Nights in the Forest, right? Late 1960s. You see, it's interesting to see the trajectory, to see how thinking has changed about forests based on the colonial state, the British colonial context versus India's independence, right? The nation state. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. So there's these, let me read this one, give you some context here. This is another way to put eco-critical writings in perspective, is to give them a historical context. It's not necessary all the time, but that's what I've done. So, the first generation of writers upon independence generally had inevitably imbibed colonial era ideas, but by the 1960s and 70s there was sufficient distance from both colonial rule and early nationalist promises to gain some perspective on this past. In this period, and I'm relying on some scholars here, small towns across the country gained economic prowess with the growth of agricultural output, and in turn gained political clout, challenging the influence of urban India's young and aspiring educated classes. Political agitation in towns and cities on numerous fronts, from anti-Hindi Tamil movements and anti-immigrant Marathi regionalists to communist movements in West Bengal and Kerala, further induced a feeling of insecurity among young urbanites. So this is the context for the novel. Who clung to idealizations of village India, despite evidence to the contrary. So it's in this context that Gangopadhyay's 1968 novel, Aranyar Din Ratri, we should look at, one way to look at it. It's also a critique of the upper classes, the Bhadralok, sort of this idea of who are kind of these young men. If you don't know, there's these four men who kind of arbitrarily decide to stop in one place. They want to go and experience nature and get away from the urban scene, and most of them are dissatisfied with their lives. This is 1968. It's a long time, quite a while ago, but they're very modern, urbane, and so they also have these pre-expectations, right? I think when we read these writers, we have to ask how they are countering our pre-expectations. What are they making us unlearn about the tribal, the Santals in this case, right? And they stop in a forest in which is now, I think, Jharkhand state, but was in West Bengal at the time. infused with idealizations of tribal men and especially women whom they identify with the wiles of the jungle, each of the four friends is forced to confront his own, perhaps racial, cultural, and sexual prejudices. Gangopadhyay's forest or jungle, since he uses both the terms, is associated with the full range of images and tropes that are familiar, such as, and these are quotes from the English translation, "It is a veritable garden, an enchanting chiaroscuro of daylight fading slowly and darkness descending." That also invokes the title. "And where everything has become easy, including the availability of sex. One doesn't have to feel modesty in the jungle," Robi exults. "The forest is also a wilderness." We've encountered that word. Now, these are English translations, so it depends on how you translate it, "in which there is nothing to see or do." That's a common trope that urban writers of forests tend to invoke all over the world. But what are these people doing? They're just lazy, right? And there's nothing to do. There's nothing to do. There's nothing to see. Surprising, we may think, because we've thought about these questions, but these are ordinary young professionals. Where the local Adivasis and Santals have behaved rather peculiarly, even mysteriously, and lived according to a different set of rules. So again, these are the tropes that I find. I mean, I'm not saying you will find those will catch your eye. But what surprises the young men is that money has found a purchase in this forest world. Right? That's not what they were expecting. It is not the untouched retreat they had imagined it to be. To the contrary, this is a world that still perpetuates colonial practices. Gangopadhyay portrays a forest that is nothing like the idol of ashramic detachment from materiality. It is decidedly not a kind of tapovana or forest school that Tagore emulated. It instead stages the rape of a Santal woman, Duli, at the hands of one of the four men, Robi, its tough subjects. The men's superficial dalliances with the two genteel Calcutta women, and the city dwellers' condescending attitudes towards the Santals and the workers of the government bungalow. By the end of the novel, Robi has been beaten up by a group of Santal men for accosting Duli, the woman, and the four men have had their friendships tested, and each one has had to confront the prejudices hiding behind his bourgeois self. This is, after all, a Bengali novel, so it's going to have some Marxist overtones. So this idea of bourgeoisie, especially when interacting with the Santals. Now, if I could step out of the text, what we call the paratext, and we think, I'm not a film expert, but what I've read about Ray's filming, Ray, Satyajit or Rai, but Ray, is that he was clearly loved Kolkata. That was his passion, right? And it is a great city of intellectual intellect and books and all this, and arts. But it's interesting that this is a story that's very critical of the urban youth at the time. They're disaffected. They don't know what to do. Now, is that their fault or not? That's a different story. So there's that. There's also, for me, an unsettling fact that the actress who portrays Duli, the famous Garwal, what's her name? Someone know? It's slipped my brain. I told you I'm getting old. But, and I'm even older than when we started this lecture. But the idea that she has to put makeup on to make her Adivasi, that's very disturbing to me, right? And what we call in America blackface. So if you try to portray, because it has a history. Now, I'm not saying it has a history in India, but couldn't you get another actress? So these are the paratexts that raise other issues. Now, that is not specific to the eco-critical point, but it does raise the question of the fact that Gangopadhyay's, I think it's a great novel, and Gangopadhyay is critical of these four men, and so is Ray's movie. But after all, the medium through which we see it, the tribals don't have a say, really. These are not, and on the other hand, this is the paradox we run into. If you do give them a voice, this is post-colonial part coming in, then you're sort of being the arbiter and giving them agency. You're ventriloquizing their existence. That's inauthentic. It's what, of course, what Spivak talked about with the subaltern idea. So, how do you access that? But that's the same problem as accessing non-human worlds. How do you do that? You can't entirely. You just have to do your best. There is no pure way of doing this, and I think that's one important lesson here, that there are some writers who do that better than others, and we're learning. So I wanted to make that point. I think we have I forgot when we started exactly, but we have another 5-10 minutes. Yeah. I know you'll say whatever I say, but I want to be honest here. I wasn't listening to this. So another trope that we want to keep in mind, and then I'll end with touching on Saro-Wiwa, is that Raymond Williams wrote a book, The Country and the City, in the early 1970s, and that idea still pertains. I mentioned Gilgamesh and the city and all that. So if we back up, I've zoomed in on a couple of novels. If we back up and talk about how, if that's true that we have always looked at this city and country, how is modern writing different, right? And that, in that sense, I think modern writing is trying to bring a more ethical focus, for one thing. Secondly, it's trying to, as I said, decenter the human. Even if you go back to any epic, whether it's Gilgamesh or anything, the humans are always the center, And that's understandable, right? That it wasn't, You may say, they're in their mythic stories, the Greeks, they talked about animals, but it's always with humans at the center. So the one thing that post-colonial writers do is, like Ghosh, is to try their best to make us see not just different things, the non-human world, but also to see the marginalized views, right? The oppressed. And that's hard to do, but I think that's an important takeaway. So the country and the city becomes, as Raymond Williams did, it can still kind of preserve an idealized version of untouched local culture that he had, even though he was a Marxist, and so he still idealized that. And I think there's a lot of countries, I think most countries, the narratives about the nation are built on this construct of the ideal sort of certain lands, villages, or, mera gaon, mera desh, and this idea, and then the same thing in America, right? The heartland, they say, is the rural areas. That's not true anymore, right? If it ever was. And so I think that construct is something we have to dig into and deconstruct. So Ken Saro-Wiwa, and I think we just have a couple of minutes here, I'm shifting now to the Nigerian writer, and this introduces the term petrocultures. So Rob Nixon uses that term to talk about in slow violence and the environmentalism of the poor. Slow violence and the environmentalism of the poor. And I like that term. He's not the only one to notice that. For example, Rachel Carson talks about pollution as a slow movement. That's where he really gets inspired to this term. You don't see it. When humans don't see something, we're kind of too stupid to, appreciate that. That's why climate change isn't. Now, if you're in it, if you bear the brunt, yes, but not everyone does, but we still suffer from it, like pollution and so forth. So he's from a small group called the Ogoni people of Nigeria, and I've learned something more about Nigeria from my Nigerian doctoral students. And so there are many different languages, Igbo, Hausa, and so forth, Yoruba. And they produce some fantastic literature these days. He was a writer who was popular for television writing as well as novels. He even produced a novel in Pidgin English, right? Soza Boy, which is fascinating. And you have to have a glossary to read it, right? So he's a brilliant writer. In 1995, he had always protested the giving over of the small minority their land to Shell Oil Company. Now, we all here know about the East India Company having an army of 100,000 people. I mean, what kind of corporation has an army? Well, Shell also effectively did. They had hired these security forces, thousands of them, because the government was getting kickbacks, right? The dictatorship of Abacha. And Rob Nixon also talks about this, as does William Boyd, a British novelist who knew Sarawiwa. And oil was always at the center in fact, it was at the center of the civil war for Nigeria, the Biafra War in late 1960s that both Chinua Achebe and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie talk about. So, and I hadn't known that was at the center, right, until recently. So Sarawiwa said he had been campaigning so much that they put him in prison, first of all. So he wrote this great thing, I wish I had time to read it, an open list of demands that he drafted and was published from prison. He says, "We, the people of Ogoni," and then he names several subgroups, numbering about 500,000, being a separate and distinct ethnic nationality within the Federal Republic of Nigeria, wish to draw the attention of the government and people of Nigeria to the undermentioned facts. And he gives a whole bunch. And in the notes here, I just have 10 of them. And I'm just going to read 2. That the Ogoni people, before the advent of British colonialism, were not conquered or colonized by any other ethnic group in present-day Nigeria. And then he goes on and talks about that oil was struck and produced in commercial quantities on our land in 1958. Did they see the profits? No. He was hanged by the Abacha government, right? Despite an international outcry, despite many writers, leaders. And that's what happens. That's petroculture when you're so corrupted by, this is from the land, right? This is the land that gives you the petroleum. And we know these stories throughout the world, right? From Venezuela on, where that then, that's where the question of who owns the land comes in. It raises all kinds of existential questions. It raises questions about how do we exploit, why are we exploiting the land in this way? And Shell Oil has never to this day apologized, right? So I'm not being paid to criticize Shell Oil, but it's a big company. It's a British-Dutch company. But the point is that this is the reality. So Sarawiwa does this very eloquently in that journal that I assigned parts of, A Month and a Day. I think that this can really be a powerful way of learning when someone puts their life on the line for the land. It's also for his people, to be sure, but it's also for the land. So I think that's something we can keep in mind. I don't think there's time to go. I think it's time. Yeah, sorry. If you're interested, the Jangwa Dema's writing, the Botswanian British writer who emigrated to UK, has some wonderful prize-winning poems about. It's called Anne/Other Pastoral. So she's talking about land in different ways. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, too. I think it's lunchtime.